Good evening. Good to see everyone here. We'll be continuing in our study of Daniel. And last week, I guess after about 20 minutes of the class, the recording turned off, or the audio went out. We're going to do a little bit of review just for those who weren't here and those who were following along online. But it's a good section to review because it does lay the groundwork for some of the visions that we see later on in the book and really get our frame of reference ready for those. So looking back, just to begin, as we have been, we want to just remember the themes of Daniel as we go through this. First, that God rules the kingdoms of men, and then to be faithful in suffering. So this book was written for the Jews at that time as they were in captivity, and whether they were still in Jerusalem, or which had been conquered and the temple destroyed, or that they were the ones that were in captivity in Babylon. Once we get to the end of this book and the people are returning, they're going to need encouragement, both for the challenges they're going to face as captives that have been freed and are returning to try to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and also then for the period of time they're going to face where God is not going to be having a prophet active in their land, and that 400 years of silence that we read about between the New Testament, or between the Testaments, to help them remember that God has not abandoned them. God has a plan, and He has identified these kingdoms that we're going to talk about again here in chapter 2, and that it's all part of His, all under His control. And so with that knowledge, then they can know that, okay, it doesn't matter what happens here, we know God's going to be there for us and God is going to provide. We, as readers today, we can get the same benefits of these things, knowing that God rules in the kingdoms of men, that we aren't the ultimate responsible ones for what happens in our nations, that we need to do our part as far as remaining faithful and sharing the word, sharing the gospel, to be the salt of the earth for the nation to be preserved. But when God determines a nation's time is done, that's in His control as well. And so that we need to be able to trust Him in those things, and also that we be faithful in suffering, so that we can look at these examples, and as we'll look at one tonight as well, how we can remain faithful when challenges arise. So we talked about Nebuchadnezzar having a dream, and he wanted the Chaldeans and the sorcerers and mystics that he employed to not just tell him the interpretation, but to tell him what the dream was in the first place. So putting down a very large challenge for them, but one that would prove that they could be trusted if they could actually complete it. They, however, sought some other way of doing it, some more time, perhaps just go ahead and tell us the dream. And so he knew that they were stalling, and he was going to put them all to death. And by putting all of his wise men to death, that was going to include Daniel and his friends, the Jews that had been employed by Nebuchadnezzar. And so we saw Daniel's faithful response. First, the fact that he finds out that this is going to happen, that he takes action that he can, and goes and seeks an audience with the king to tell him that he would be able to, that God would provide the dream and the interpretation, even before God had revealed to him that was his plan. He, out of faith, went ahead and made that appointment. Then God did reveal the dream to Daniel, and Daniel immediately prays a prayer of thanksgiving and praise to God and thankfulness for that gift. And then when he goes to interpret the dream and tell him what the dream was, he doesn't take credit for himself. He identifies that this is not something that a man can do. I, Daniel, am not going to be able to tell you this, but God is telling you the dream through me. And so he gives credit to God of being able to interpret the dream. So as we looked at the the dream itself, he identified it was a terrible and awesome statue that really, it seemed to strike fear into his heart. This was a dream that he appears to have been having on multiple occasions, and it was really getting to him. And so we think this, perhaps maybe that's why he was so short-fused with the sorcerers and interpreters that they couldn't help him. But he has this dream, and like I said last week, none of the statues that I could find really struck fear into my heart. And so this is as close as I was able to find of something reasonable. But it does convey power, and it is just an interesting thing to behold. If you just didn't have Daniel's interpretation, and you were only given the first part, told what the dream was, it would be something that is very intriguing, I would think. This head of gold, chest and arms of silver, middle and thighs of bronze, legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. And then there was a stone that was cut from without hands, and it rolled and struck the statue and at the feet and obliterated the feet. And it wasn't just the feet that were destroyed. The whole statue then was destroyed and made as chaff and disappeared. And that small stone that was cut without hands became a mountain that would not be overcome. And we can see that Daniel identifies a couple of these kingdoms, but he identifies the real key for us is that these different metals represent different kingdoms that would be coming. And there were 4 kingdoms that would be coming, and then there was the stone that was a separate kingdom. And so the head of gold, he identifies to Nebuchadnezzar that is Babylon, that he is the head of gold, and it represents him and his nation. And then the chest and the arms of silver, those can be identified as the Medo-Persian Empire that came right after Babylon, and we'll read about that later in the book. And then as he's going through these descriptions, he's saying that each one is inferior to the one before. And that's really kind of backwards of military thinking, because each one of these had actually a larger amount of land that they had captured, a larger amount of tribute that they were collecting. And so it doesn't fit with our regular thought of military tactics and so forth. But it's really, it seems to me that the inferiority is more of the leaders and the character of the nations themselves. As Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar were the head of gold, he was a brilliant leader and tactician, and he responded to God. He was by no means converted or did not become a Jew in any way, but he recognized when God performed a miracle that God deserved credit for it, and it would change his action. So it would stir repentance within Nebuchadnezzar, whereas the following nations were less and less concerned with God and more concerned with deifying themselves. So the middle and thighs of bronze represented the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great. And when he finished his conquering and died, his land was split up between four tetrarchs, and those fought amongst themselves, and Rome ended up rising as the fourth empire, and it was represented by legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. And it's important that we read that the way that the Bible has it written, that the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay are one empire. Because what the world, or some premillennial groups try to do, is split those two empires and make it so that the legs of iron is Rome, and then later on there will be the feet that will be conquered, and that will be when they say that Christ will return for his 1,000-year reign on earth. And this does not support that at all. And the Bible in general doesn't support that doctrine. So those legs of iron and feet of iron and clay were the Roman Empire, and then as the stone that was cut from without hands, it is the church. And when the church comes, it's something new. It's not the Jews. It's not the Israelites or Judah. This is a new kingdom that is coming, and it forms a mountain, and it reigns supreme over all. The other empires are obliterated, and no one ever conquers the mountain, that new kingdom. Any comments or thoughts on this so far? All right. So we see that interpretation is given to Nebuchadnezzar. So then it's time for him to decide what his response is going to be. And we see it's a positive. Nebuchadnezzar honors Daniel. He promoted him. He gave him money and gifts. But he also honors God. And largely in part, of course, to Daniel honoring God so much in what he was doing, that helped Nebuchadnezzar to know that he should honor God in his response as well. And that's a lesson that we can always be reminded of that when something in our lives happens, and we need to make sure we're honoring God, and not just in our minds to ourselves, that I'm really thankful that happened, just in our internal dialogue, but sharing that, making sure that other people, not to make a scene out of it, but letting other people know that we want to give God the glory for what happened. We want to honor God for delivering us from a problem, or helping us in some way, giving us blessings, that we identify that our blessings come from God, and perhaps then at some point they will realize that blessings come from God, and then want to know more about that, and we can help lead them to Christ. So Daniel has a very positive influence on Nebuchadnezzar there. And then Nebuchadnezzar, at Daniel's request, also honors Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And those were the three of the men that were brought into the captivity with Daniel. Those are their Babylonian names. But he kind of sets the stage for this next chapter that we're going to be looking at. Let me switch. Switch over to that real quick. So as we begin the themes of Daniel, we won't go into detail on those, but we'll get right into chapter 3. So Nebuchadnezzar builds a golden image. And so in verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, and the treasurers, and the justices, and magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. I'm going to stop there so I don't have to read any further of those tongue twisters of those titles. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar sets up this golden image and invites these different officials, various officials, to come and to a dedication. And I think it's interesting that it's kind of a vague invitation, come to the dedication. And then, as we see here, he's going to command them to worship it in just a moment. So the dimensions of this image, just to give some context, is 60 cubits by 6 cubits. So we all are familiar with cubits, right? Yeah. I believe it's like when talking about horses, there's so many hands high, and that's like, I really don't know what that is. But cubits, I'm told, is the length from the tip of your fingers to your elbow. And so we've kind of standardized that to roughly 18 inches. As you know, some are longer than others. Some people have cut the tips of their fingers off. Mike. But that gives you the general idea of that size. So 90 feet tall, but 9 feet wide. And so it's very tall but slender object. It may have been that the total size of it was 90 feet tall once the image was set up on some sort of platform or stage of some kind, but that's just a guess from people. I have a picture here of our Mother of the Mountains or something. Okay. So this is, and we happened to be driving through there a couple weeks ago, and I was looking up at the mountain, I was saying, is there something up there? And then as we got closer, you could see it was, this statue. And this statue is 90 feet tall. So, it kind of is a difficult perspective to work with from this far away. But as you can see from closer, in at least comparison to these trees, which, I would expect are fairly tall, you can see that the statue towers over those. But to get the real feel of how tall it is, you have to get close up. And so these people and this bus are tiny compared to that towering statue. And this one is on a mountain, and it's kind of hard to see from some angles. And you have to get close to it to really see what it is. But this one that Nebuchadnezzar put up was put up in the plain of Dura in Babylon. And so this would be a large flat area. So imagine instead this was in the middle of the prairie, then you would be able to see it from quite a distance around. And so that reminded me of the Tower of Babel, how they set up this tower there, and it was a monument to themselves. And that's the impression I get with this. Nebuchadnezzar is building this for his gods, but really it seems to be a monument to himself and secondarily to his God. Any comments, questions so far, Becky?
The 20 years in between the two chapters. I have a note that there was 20 years in between.
Okay.
When Daniel did the interpretation and then when Nebuchadnezzar built this next.
I couldn't find any for sure of the time distance would be, but that is a reasonable amount of time. This statue, with all their helicopters and building machines that they have today, well, it was back in 79 or to 85, took 6 years to build. True, it would be difficult to get stuff to that particular location, so that could have made it take longer. But at that time, to build a tower of that size and magnitude, it probably would have taken quite a long time. I mean, what's that? Yeah, and it's gold, and it's not clear if it was pure gold all the way through, which would have been very expensive and kind of unlikely, but at least it was overlaid in gold. And so it would have been very majestic and awe-inspiring and be able to be seen, especially with the sun shining off it from miles and miles around. Larry?
Always had the impression that on the heels of the interpretation that he just got, that the head of gold and that's you, could have been some of the reasoning why he decided to build the statue.
Yeah, that he was perhaps inspired.
And overlay it in gold and look at me.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are some commentaries or some people that felt the same way, that this kind of got in his head and maybe wasn't, why he was doing it, but it had planted that seed that, I'm the gold standard of kings and, I should be honored. John?
That statue at?
Butte, Montana. Lady of the Rockies, that's what it is. Thank you. So, the bottom line is that he built this statue, really, we can understand, to glorify himself. And it doesn't appear that he was really seeking to be humble and just to glorify his God. Steve?
I had read that kind of the obelisk style of statue was a Babylonian, Mesopotamian kind of structure to build, so
right.
The skinny tall thing was kind of a normal thing for them.
Yeah.
And also, something else I had read that I thought was just kind of an interesting element is they were talking, I read something, and it was talking about the statue as kind of a state-sponsored religion, kind of a unifying type of deal. And so, so Nebuchadnezzar might be just bringing out, hey, here's something we can all do together.
Right.
Trying to, because he has all the leaders of all the nations swearing fealty to this state-sponsored religion, whether it was in his image or just a Babylonian image of some
purpose.
sort. But just so them rejecting it is actually rejecting a patriotic thing to do.
Right. Mike?
It's also kind of interesting to me. Everybody that he invites, these are going to be the people that enforce this. Because obviously everybody in his kingdom is not going to be there.
Right. Yeah, these are
all these people
the officials.
Back to where their respective rule is, and they're going to enforce this. So.
Yep, and it probably was a big deal to get the honor of representing your area, your province, to go to the dedication of this great this statue, and I've been referring to it as a statue, but I really think it's, like Steve said, it's more of like an obelisk, like the Washington Monument. Just because of it would be a really skinny guy and that doesn't really, show power that he would be showing it, as opposed to the obelisk, which kind of was a national symbol, if somewhat. So. And I think you're right. I think that's the purpose of the way that it's described, with all the different official titles that are given, represent not just perhaps that these were all in each nation, but these were the special officials, their special title for each nation. So you'd have equivalent today would be presidents, prime ministers, kings, whatever the rulers' names, titles were for those areas. So we see I'm going to just jump back here real quick. In 4, and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So I agree, this definitely appears to be a pulling together of the various cultures that would be represented, not just because they were having their own people there under their own titles, but they also were bringing their culture together. And instead of having 10 different ways of doing things, they were saying, hey, bring your instruments, bring your style of worship, and let's all come together and be unified in worshiping this God and this statue that it represents. And that really is a smart strategy of Nebuchadnezzar to promote peace within his realm and not have nations rising up. I think the strategy works well especially if the people aren't as dedicated to their God as the Jews were. If they didn't have the knowledge and experience to know that their God was the one true God and it wasn't just something that just be exchanged. And so the people would probably be, a lot of them would be fine saying, okay, well, we'll still have our style of worship. It's just pointed in a different direction. That's fine. We're on board with it. But there were some that were not. Larry?
What happened at the end of the previous chapter where Daniel essentially became very prominent in the king's court and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it seems to me like they would also be potentially in this group of people that are at this.
Yeah, and I believe the titles, or it didn't give the title in 49, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel remained in the king's court. It appears to me that Daniel is not present for whatever reason, but that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are, and they're the representation for their group in this dedication festival. All right. So, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace." So they lay the groundwork. In case you forgot, king, let me review this law you made and what its consequences are. And so then in verse 12, they get to their point. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So there the accusation is made, and it's true. So they feel like they're in a really good spot now with this. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought, so they brought these men before the king. So Nebuchadnezzar, we talked a little bit about his character, how he was a great tactician and strategist. He was very wise and clever, and especially in giving the challenge to the interpreters of not even telling them what the dream is, to make sure that he got a true answer. But we also read about him being having a temper, or being dangerous, whether it was the chief of the eunuchs, who was concerned that he was going to get his head cut off if Daniel and his friends didn't look healthy as the other men, or the dream interpreters, the wise men that failed, and he was going to kill them all. We see that he had a very strong sense of, I don't know if the word is justice, but punishment for people that failed to meet his standards. And so here we see that he was in a furious rage. And so in verse 14, it said, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, so this is to the men, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" So he brings them in. He doesn't immediately kill them, which I think is interesting. He doesn't say, okay, well, just have them sent to that furnace and be thrown in. He brings them in to question them and find out for sure. See?
He's going through this whole effort to get all these people here to have this uniting thing, and the people who run his own city. So it's just like, do you even have your house in order, Nebuchadnezzar, if you're doing this to unite us all? And then it's like if the men from the president's cabinet don't stand up and do the Pledge of Allegiance, or don't stand during the anthem or whatever. It's like, wait a minute, we're going to do this to show everybody that we're all patriotic, but then the guys who are running my own cabinet, which is are kneeling during the anthem, or some disrespectful thing.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't look good.
Nope, these aren't the people running some backwoods province that nobody really cares. No, these are Babylon. This is the capital, and these guys are standing in opposition to this thing that Nebuchadnezzar is thinking, this is supposed to unite us. Now you guys are making me look bad, first of all, but also it could cause actual problems like rebellion if people feel like they can stand up and ignore these commands. So yeah, it definitely, if you look at it just purely from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, he definitely has a reason to be in a furious rage with these guys. So then in 15, he's asked them, is this true that you're not worshiping my God? And he said, now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship at the image I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? So he gives them one last chance. And this is really seems merciful compared to the other things we see from him. But I think it kind of fits where he didn't immediately have all those people, all the wise men killed. Daniel had an opportunity to plead his case. And so he didn't immediately have these guys killed. He wanted to find out. And he gave Jerusalem, 3 strikes before he destroyed the temple. So he doesn't want to have to just take the ultimate measures, but he gives them this chance for everything to be okay, and they reject it. And we'll see that they reject it. And he warns them, if you don't take this chance, you will be put to death. And it doesn't matter what has come before, what arrangements we've made in the past, this will supersede any of that. Steve?
See this sense of religion. He's like, what? I'm real. Your God isn't. Your God is weaker than my God at least. But, it's almost like lip service to religion instead of actual belief in religion. And he's like, what God can deliver you from my hands? I'm right here. I have a fire right there. We're going to throw you in it. So reconsider.
Yeah.
And it's all, but you see almost in the previous chapter was the same thing. I don't want you guys to tell me what you think it means. I want you to tell me the dream so I know you're telling me the interpretation. Here he's saying all these people worshiping all these different gods, but it's all superficial. It's just like pomp. And It's like, but I'm right here. I'm
Yeah.
not going to kill you, so why are you worshiping a God that can't save you?
Yeah, and basically worship me, because I'm the one who will throw you in the fire.
And also,
Mike?
that's how the world deals with even Christianity. You know, it's like, why lose your job, or why go through that for what you believe when it's going to cost you if you lose your job, or it's going to cost you if you suffer.
Yeah.
So, and
And
a lot
we'll-
of people have religion that way.
Yep, and we'll look a little more at that as well in a moment. Mike?
With everything that Steve just said, considering that, you know, and I don't, like we were talking about, we don't know the time span between this and the dream scenario. That right there should have been something of a heads up, that he wasn't dealing with just some God. To me, what he has just done, is he has thrown the gauntlet down, not to these three men, but to God. You know, he is actually challenging God, which he's already had a taste of, that he could do something that nobody else could do.
Right.
And so I'm just kind of curious where his mindset is. I mean, that's a pretty short memory.
Right. Well, I think we'll see Nebuchadnezzar he forgets. And it's not necessarily that he just doesn't think about it, but he doesn't make connections that we make. Because he doesn't see the God that interpreted his dream as having ultimate power in every other way. He just sees that as, that's the only thing he's seen that God do, and he's never seen that God, save somebody from the fire or anything else. So he's got God, has put God into a very small box. Yeah, and so he doesn't really expect God to be able to do that. Really?
But I think he's acting like almost everybody does. It's like we all have sins that we struggle with, and throughout the years, and they tend to be, for me, it's lots of times the same. One will kind of creep up.
Yeah.
And it'll be years, and I think, okay, I've kind of got that under control or whatever, and so I just think, oh, we all do that, I think.
Yep. And I think that's what we'll see here, and then in a little bit further on, is that one of his faults is his pride. And so he will be proud and feel self-sufficient, like a self-made man. And then he had that dream that he couldn't figure out, and it humbled him. And so he gave credit to God. And then he's, feeling better, whether 10 or 20 years have passed, and he's, forgotten about that, and that pride has crept in, and he's not, like, we actively try to keep our faults in check, under control, and he's not really concerned about that. That doesn't really serve his purposes. So his pride is growing and growing, and now it's going to be checked, and he's going to be humbled, but he's going to accept it well. And we're going to read a little bit further on. His pride's going to build back up again, and he's going to have to be humbled. So, yeah, I agree totally. We all have certain things we struggle with that can tend to work in cycles, and it's good in a way that if we have the same problems, that we know what to watch for. At least it's not like totally new problems every time, and so then it blindside us, and we don't know what to expect. But we, like you're saying, we all have things that we struggle with over periods of time, and we get them under control, and we just have to try to maintain that. Do you have a comment, Joe?
In my mind, yes. Well, it just seems kind of funny to me a little bit. I mean, even after Daniel tells him, God gave you the dream, God interpreted the dream, it's God that gave you everything, all power to rule over this kingdom, And what's he do? He honors the messenger, not God. He doesn't humble himself before God. He's just like you said, he just considers him another a god, not the God. And, and I think he's going to come on and start learning some of that in the next few verses here.
Yeah.
But
And he also would have the feeling of, what has he done for me lately? That's old. That God might be dead now, who knows? That it's we never quite know how that mindset was back then, because we just are it's so foreign to us. But yeah, we can have some of the same kind of problems, whether we're minimizing without even thinking about what God can do, or we forget what he has done, or we start relying on other people or things, and when we should be relying on God. So yes, he is going to be humbled here. Where were we? Okay, so he had just asked, who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? And in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you on this matter. Wow, that's bold. And part of it is, that there's verses in you answer a fool according to his folly, or even when Jesus was on trial, they would ask questions and he wouldn't respond. So there are times when this is appropriate, and obviously this is one of those times. And it even kind of made me think of in a legal scenario of was about to have them strike up the band and go through their trial of whether or not they would worship his God, and it wasn't a guilty or not guilty. It's like, I don't know the legal differences, but this was like a no contest. We're not even going to even engage in this. That's not going to happen. We're not going to worship that God. So don't waste your time and their energy by playing the music. And I don't think it was as harsh as sounding in when they said it as when we read it, because we're kind of taken aback by it. But I think it was enough that it got his attention too. So in 17, if this be so, if you are going to destroy us or throw us in the furnace, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So they go ahead and say, yeah, it's a slap in the face. They say, God is going to deliver us from you, one way or another. Either he is going to deliver us from you by taking us out of the furnace unharmed, or the furnace is going to burn up our bodies and our souls will be free from you and your claim on us. But no matter what happens, we're not going to worship your God. Either we will come out and conquered and victorious, or we will be dead and you will not get the pleasure of us worshiping your God, and we will not soil ourselves by worshiping your God. And Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and his expression on his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it usually was heated. And so he was upset already. He had seemed like he had kind of gained his composure and was giving them their second chance, and they rejected it mightily. And that really made him blow his top. And he had him heat the furnace 7 times the usual. I don't know how many degrees the furnace usually was, and if it was actually able to get to 7 times, if that's a figure of speech. I lean toward the latter. But I was wondering, did they just have fiery furnaces around? What is the reason for that? But if they were smelting or purifying all this gold for his idol, then it would make sense that's one use they would have had for that. So there would have been a furnace ready and waiting. And the way that they describe it at the beginning, it sounds like it might have just been a regular method of capital punishment. Just like what we're going to read about later in the lion's den. They didn't just happen to find a bunch of lions in a den. I don't think it was just a zoo exhibit. I think that was one of those punishments that they had ready and waiting, to deter people from not following the king. So he has it fired up 7 times hotter than usual. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments. They didn't take time to, mess around with taking their stuff. They just bound them as is. And they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. So, so it appears to me to be some sort of like oven, and so you've got the door where they put the stuff in, the gold or whatever it is, and then perhaps the wood or whatever, and then they close that, and it's like got a chimney coming out of it. And so maybe they had already done the heating process, and so there may have been some sort of platform or something that they dropped them in from above. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were fine, but the men that they took them up there, they died from the heat of the flame. Steve?
The loyalty that Nebuchadnezzar obtained from people, they're willing to die just to follow his command.
Right.
And here these guys are like, doesn't matter, we don't have to answer you on this.
Yeah.
So you really see that he must have liked them to give them the second chance, because obviously these other guys, they died just to obey the command of the king.
Yes, they definitely, he did inspire loyalty. Joe?
I find it impressive, even after the interpretation of the dream and all that, where nobody else could do it, no other gods could do it, just one God. And here, throws them into the furnace. Literally says, no God can deliver you from that. There's no, all this. No other gods, but one God does. And he still says God's plural, small g.
Yeah. Yeah, he's still got a little ways to go. And some learning to do there. So, let's see. He ordered, and in 24, the king Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" The king answered, and they answered and said to the king, "True, O king." And he answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." And Nebuchadnezzar came, or stopped there, so he sees 4 men in the fire, and not only is there just an extra guy in there, they're all walking around as if nothing's going on. And so that had to have sent fear into his heart at that moment. Because of the way that he responds later, I think he realized he was dealing with something beyond himself. And the one had an appearance as like the son of gods. And I think that is not that Daniel is falling into, was it multi-theism or whatever it's called, polytheism. But I think that's just describing it in the way that they would describe it in familiar terms for them. So Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. And he declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the God, the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of the fire had come upon them. So Nebuchadnezzar identifies the source of their salvation, in the power where that came from. And he calls them out. And it talks about all those men were around that saw this thing happen. This wasn't just a closed off event where just Nebuchadnezzar saw this. This was evidence to all the officials that were there. They were all witnesses. And so I think this has a lot to do with his later proclamations that we're going to read here. But they come out and they're totally unaffected by the fire. And that's amazing because, if you sit by a campfire for the next week, you smell like it, And so God just gave his total protection and completely took the power away from the fire and showed that the power is all his. He's the source of the power, and he can overcome physical things that we are threatened with. Steve, do you have
way to understand, well, when God gives us salvation, what is it like? He washes away our sins. How well? Well, they weren't burned, their hairs weren't singed, their clothes weren't affected, and they didn't have the smell on them.
We don't even smell like sin, right?
Yeah, and really, if you think about it, it's like, God completely delivered them in every sense of delivery. He delivered them from the fire, and that's what his salvation is like for us with sin. Completely makes us righteous.
Yeah, it's not just pretty clean. We're cleansed, totally purified by Christ's blood. Exactly. So no harm had come from them, or come upon them. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except for their own." So wow, this is a big proclamation, a big 180 for Nebuchadnezzar, that he's praising them and their God for setting aside the king's command and only being willing to worship their own God. "Therefore I make a decree, any people or language, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So he praises God, gives him the proper honor and glory, and it's having these officials here, he makes a proclamation that they are not to be acted against. They are not to be harassed or harmed, or he will tear them limb from limb. So it kind of goes back to old Nebuchadnezzar. It's just showing who he really is. But he's had a great step there. He's come down from his crest of pride, and now he's back down into at least maybe not being really humble, but not putting himself in the place of God. And so we can see a good example there. Steve?
Was a military general, genius.
Right.
And he understands, you listen to the higher rank.
Yeah.
And that's what he acknowledges here. He's got a higher rank than me.
Yep.
You were right to listen to him.
Follow the chain of command, So just with the little time we have left, going back to the fiery furnace and the worshiping the image, that's really the key for us as we read this. We don't have those particular challenges at this time, but we all have our images that are placed in front of us that we are told to worship, or invited to worship, or they're just put there, and there's that temptation to worship. And we all have our consequences, the fiery furnace, of not going through with those sinful acts. And so whether it's kids with peer pressure in school, whether it's to cheat on a test or to go out and drink or do drugs or smoke or whatever, there's going to be people that want you to do it, and you have to stand firm and say, no, I'm not going to do it. And sometimes you just have to have the response of these guys where I'm not even going to answer you. This doesn't even need to be discussed. I said, no, I'm not going to go drinking and partying over at this place. I'm not going to do it. Don't even bring it up again. And there are those times where if there's that pressure, if you don't, then you'll be ostracized. And this isn't just for kids. That's just an easy way to think of it, because we all either have gone through that peer pressure or are going through it or will soon. But any pressure to sin is going to have these elements where someone's going to want you to do something, whether it's a person or it's Satan himself. They're going to want you to do something, and you have to stand firm against it, even when it's clear there are going to be consequences, negative consequences, for not doing the wrong thing, for just standing up for what's right. And in Peter, I believe it is, he says, don't be surprised when you're treated badly and persecuted for doing the right thing. That's going to happen. Just don't be in the situation where you're persecuted for doing the wrong thing. That's something you can avoid. But if someone's going to persecute you for doing the right thing, that's not within your control. That's within God's control. And if God allows that to happen, then so be it. And if God delivers you from the situation, then praise God for that. Any ideas on the concept of the fiery furnaces, Rick?
Sometimes influence us to do those things, to put something before God, is ourselves.
Right.
It's so easily we can fall into the trap of putting something before our worship to the Lord, or scheduling something on a Sunday, or whatever it may be. So sometimes we have to watch ourselves and always remember to always put God first in our lives as well.
Yeah, the person who watches out and tries to fulfill our desires the most is always us. And when those desires are contrary to God's will, we need to be on guard against ourselves for those. Any other ideas or comments? All right. Well, we're pretty close to on time. Let's close.